Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the program today. I chose to do this one this week just because I thought it would be certainly appropriate for the holiday coming up. Many people are interested in tracing their ancestry back to a passenger on the Mayflower. It's a frequent question we get here in the Genealogy Center. It can be a difficult challenge for some, as is gathering up the necessary proof for joining the Mayflower Society, which is a hereditary organization that you can join if you can prove your descent from one of the passengers on the Mayflower. This year marks the 401st anniversary of the Mayflower's arrival and the 400th anniversary of that first Thanksgiving that was held sometime in the fall, the late fall of 1621. So I thought it was appropriate, as Thanksgiving has arrived, that we observe it again, the people that started it. There's a lot of interest, of course, in the ship and the stalwart group of people who established the first permanent settlement in New England. Sailing of the Mayflower and the arrival of the Pilgrims is one of the most iconic events in American history. In some respects, it has been surrounded by myth, especially the celebration of Plymouth Rock and the Thanksgiving holiday. Children learn about the Mayflower in elementary school, where they make cutout pilgrim hats with buckles and big white collars, and we see costumed characters with pilgrim heads marching in parades. The truth about the Pilgrims requires a lot more digging. The good news is that there has been a lot of great studies by historians that place the colonists in greater context, and many new genealogical discoveries in English records for what is perhaps the most studied group in American history. Together, this scholarship enhances greatly what we know about them and how we can best appreciate their legacy. As genealogists, we are living in the best of times for the study of Plymouth Colony, and we can look forward in the future to even more new information coming to light. So, are you a Mayflower descendant? Some 35 million Americans are, which is significant out of a total population of about 327 million. Being descended from a pilgrim is considered an honor among some genealogists and among New Englanders generally, who view the Pilgrim Fathers as sort of the nation's founders, even though Plymouth came some 13 years after the founding of Jamestown in Virginia. Many famous people are Mayflower descendants, and finding kinship to one of them can be fun, as is the whole process of trying to establish an ancestral link to this group of early Americans. Some people have charged the study of the Pilgrims as being what's called filial piety, which is kind of a $20 word, which means inflating importance of one's ancestors. And they say that in the 19th century, there was a sort of an overly patriotic way of viewing them and putting them on pedestals when in fact they weren't on pedestals. They were just ordinary folks, and trying to study them in new ways makes them maybe less the granite objects of the past. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the program today. Finding a link to the Mayflower involves first knowing who among the 102 passengers left descendants. Many families have stories or traditions about having a Mayflower connection, and over the years on the desk, I've heard people say they're descended from someone on that ship who was not one of one of the names of people on that ship. So here is a list of the 24 men who were passengers on the Mayflower with descendants. I have added this information on your handout along with those that had wives who traveled on the Mayflower. So they are Francis Cook, Miles Standish, Francis Eaton, Samuel Fuller, Edward Fuller, William White, William Bradford, William Brewster, Isaac Allerton, John Alden, and through his wife Priscilla, also William Mullins, Peter Brown, Deggery Priest, John Billington, Edward Winslow, John Howland, and through his wife Elizabeth, John Tilley, James Chilton, Richard Moore, Thomas Rogers, George Sowell, Edward Doty, Richard Warren, Henry Sampson, Stephen Hopkins, and Moses Fletcher. Those are the 24. All of the others on the ship, as far as we know, died without having surviving children. Moses Fletcher came over and as an adult, leaving his adult children behind in Holland. They married into Dutch families, and all of their descendants are in the Netherlands today. So that's just a note. And he's the only one that doesn't have a silver book out. All of the others do have silver books, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So I want to talk a little bit about the timeline of Pilgrims, but I don't want to go deep into the history because I want to focus instead on the tools you can use for tracing your genealogy back to them. However, I think it's important for any Mayflower researcher to know the basic outline of the story and the timeline of important dates. In the early part of the 1600s in England, there were a growing number of Protestants who were upset with the practices of the Church of England, especially after King James I ascended the throne in 1603. They disliked especially the creeping number of Catholic practices that were part of the church's liturgy. And that included kneeling when receiving communion, the observance of saints' days, the power vested in bishops, the use of rings at weddings, and making the sign of the cross at an infant's baptism. Some even denounced church burials as popish ceremonies. Puritans who founded Massachusetts were those who thought the church could be purified from within, while separatists who founded Plymouth believed that the cause of reform was hopeless. Instead, they needed to separate themselves entirely from the church and its practices. The problem for them was that leaving the church was a form of sedition against the state. It was against the law. Separatist congregations were established in secret in various parts of England, including one at the Manor House in Scrooby, Nottinghamshire, where William Brewster lived. Brewster was university educated and had held a minor diplomatic post until his mentor and sponsor, William Davison, the one-time ambassador to the Netherlands, fell out of favor with the crown and was put in prison. Brewster corresponded with other separatists, including the Reverend John Robinson and the Reverend Richard Clifton, who were both ordained priests. With the authorities threatening arrest, they decided to flee the country for Leiden in Holland, where they could worship freely. They lived for a year in Amsterdam before moving in 1609 to Leiden, where they established a separatist congregation that attracted members from across England wishing to worship in freedom. Those who were part of the congregation called themselves saints. The English government considered them radicals and enemies of the state. Brewster had set up a printing press in Leiden and published books against the Church of England, making him especially a target for arrest. In 1619, an alliance between England and Holland, the Spanish, led England to ask Holland, as a part of the treaty, to crack down on separatists living there. This act prompted the Pilgrims to seek a way out of Holland for the New World, where they could worship in freedom outside the threat of the English government. Many of the separatists in Leiden worked in the wool industry, which was a grueling job that involved cleaning, combing, and sorting wool, as pictured in this painting. They had to adapt to Dutch society, but they enjoyed a surprising amount of freedom there that they did not find in England at that time. I'm not going to delve deeply into the history of the Pilgrims in Leiden, but I do want to make you aware of the work of historian Jeremy Dupertuis Bangs, who is director of the Leiden American Pilgrim Museum in Leiden. Bangs has conducted extensive research on separatists living in Holland in the early 17th century. And as a result of his work, we now know a lot more about what happened during that time. Much new genealogical information about the Pilgrims has been discovered in church and court records, and as a result, many new connections have been made among these families. The number of Mayflower passengers we identify as saints has grown with these discoveries. A few of the servants on the Mayflower, such as Richard Moore and his siblings, can be shown as living in Leiden, even though they were not initially members of the church. Excuse me. Banks has produced two important books about this period. The first is titled Strangers and Pilgrims, Travelers and Sojourners, Leiden and the Foundations of Plymouth Plantation, published in 2009. It's on your handout. This is a narrative history, not a genealogical work, but is nonetheless full of names and a rich array of references from Leiden archival sources. It was a place, Bangs argues, where the character of the Pilgrim Church and subsequently the colony of Plymouth itself took form. He claims to have unearthed every reference to the Pilgrims found in Leiden archives and provides the reader with an exhaustive detail of what their lives were like, where they lived, how they worked, and what theological issues their leaders debated. Bangs also argues that some of the customs adopted in Plymouth Colony, derived from Leiden, including civil marriage laws, the layout of the town, and even the Confederate structure of representative self-government. None of these were English traditions. Bangs' newest book is called New Light on the Old Colony, Plymouth, the Dutch Context of Toleration and Patterns of Pilgrim Commemoration, published in 2020. This work contains a collection of essays, some by other writers, about the whole gamut of the Pilgrim experience. He continues to build here on the Leiden influence, especially on religious tolerance, and and that whole concept that affected the laws of Plymouth Colony later. Though Plymouth was far more restrictive than Leiden, there was some accommodation made for Quakers, though they were still often persecuted there as they were in Massachusetts Bay. So which of the pilgrims who left descendants are identified as saints or members of the Leiden congregation? Some were direct members, while others were servants of members. The direct members included William Brewster, who came from Scrooby, William Bradford, who came from nearby at Austerfield in Yorkshire, Edward Winslow, who came from Droitwich in Worcestershire, Isaac Allerton, who came from East Bergholt in Suffolk, Francis Cook, who came from Norwich, Edward and Samuel Fuller, the latter a surgeon, who came from Redden Hall in Norfolk, John Tilley and Henry Sampson from Henlow in Bedfordshire. Sampson was a servant. Thomas Rogers of Watford, Northamptonshire, Daggery Priest, a hatter in Leiden of unknown origin, but who had lived in London. William White of Wisbeck in Cambridgeshire, and Miles Standish, a soldier probably from the Isle of Man, who may or may not have been a church member, but he had close ties to the Reverend John Robinson, the minister. Also on this list are Francis Eaton, a carpenter from Bristol, and James Chilton, a tailor, and Moses Fletcher, a blacksmith, both from Kent. The strangers were people not affiliated with the Leiden Church and joined the Mayflower voyage later from London or Southampton. Some joined the church later once they were in the New World. This group that left descendants include John Alden, who was hired as a cooper in Southampton, but whose precise origin is still unknown. He later joined the church in America. Also in this group were Peter Brown and William Mullins of Dorking, Surrey, Richard Moore, who was a servant of the Brewsters from Shipton, Shropshire, Richard Warren from Great Amwell in Hertfordshire, Stephen Hopkins, who came from Hursley in Hampshire, John Billington, who came from Spalding, Lincolnshire, John Howland, who was a servant, came from Ben Stanton, Huntingdonshire, and Edward Doty, who was a servant of unknown origin. If we continue with our narrative history, a group of the separatist congregation left Leiden and returned secretly to England. At length, they negotiated a charter with the Virginia Company for land in Virginia. They hired a group of investors as well as a variety of tradesmen to assist with the voyage. Two ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower, left England on August 5th, 1620, but the Speedwell sprung a leak, and so both ships had to turn back. Neither ship was well suited for a transatlantic voyage. They had only, up to that time, sailed back and forth between England and Europe, so they had not crossed the ocean before. The Mayflower set sail again by itself on September 6 and took 10 weeks to get across the ocean. It was by this time considered late in the sailing season, and it encountered a number of storms and rough seas on the way. It finally reached what is now Provincetown at the end of Cape Cod on November 11th, even though they had intended to go to Virginia. The single most important historical event of the voyage was the signing of the Mayflower Compact on November 11th, 1620. It was a civil agreement among the males, both saints and strangers, to live together and follow the rules and laws of their colony for the sake of their mutual benefit, safety, and survival. They created what has been termed a consensual commonwealth. Even though it would later be superseded by another constitution in 1636, the compact remained important to the colony afterward and was still considered to be the original inspiration for the later government. The only authentic portrait we have of any of the pilgrims is that of Edward Winslow, who became governor of the colony after William Bradford. The records of the colony improved under his administration, and he served as the principal diplomat for the colony. The first winter in the new colony was brutal, and some 43 people, nearly half the colony, died. Scurvy, pneumonia, and tuberculosis all took a toll. Governor John Carver, before he died, negotiated a treaty with Chief Massasoit of the Wampanoag tribe in March 1621, and two Indians who spoke English, one named Samoset and the other named Squanto, helped to act as translators. The Mayflower returned to England in April of 1621. Squanto showed the colonists how to plant crops using dead fish and burying the corn on mounds. And there was a bountiful harvest in the fall of 1621. And of course, the famous Harvest Festival that today we celebrate as the first Thanksgiving, even though there were Thanksgivings in other parts of the New World, one in Augustine, Florida, one in Berkeley Plantation, Virginia, and several other places. So it was not necessarily the first Thanksgiving, but it was certainly an early one, and the one that was sort of the inspiration for the Thanksgiving that we have today. So this is a picture of the reconstructed Plymouth Plantation. It's not on the site, the actual site of Plymouth. It's a little bit further down the ocean in what was originally a rural area, but they have tried to rebuild the houses the way they looked at the time, so you can visit it and get a sense of what Plymouth was like in its early days. There are role players there that are costumed and playing the various people, and you might actually meet one of your ancestors if you descend from someone who was there. This was a very common form of English settlement, but there was also aspects of it that related to Dutch influence as well as English influence. I want just to briefly to touch on the later timeline of the colony. It continued to grow, of course. The next ship, the Fortune, arrived in November 1621, and two more, the Anne and the Little James, arrived in July of 1623. And by 1627, there was a major division of cattle in the colony, and the colony had about 156 residents. By 1630, there were about 300 people. People were fanning out and starting new towns in other areas outside of Plymouth, all part of Plymouth Colony. There were increasing conflicts with the Native Americans. The Pequots, who were the traditional enemies of the Narragansetts and the Mohegans, who were the allies of the English, were unhappy with the English being there, and there were skirmishes over the control of the fur trade that eventually escalated into a full-scale war. The Pequots were soundly defeated, and the tribe was virtually eliminated by that war, which took place in 1637 all over New England. A crippling war for New England, even worse in its severity, was the King Philip's War, which took place in 1675, which spanned all over New England again. King Philip was the son of Chief Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoag tribe, who had been at the first Thanksgiving meal and whom the colonists had successfully negotiated with in 1621. Tensions had continued to rise over the decades as more settlers arrived from England, encroaching further and further on Native American lands. The founding of the town of Swansea in Plymouth Colony in the 1660s, located near the Wampanoag major settlement of New Hope, was the catalyst for the conflict as more demands were made for relinquishing Indian land, and Philip resented the demand for further concessions. It is estimated that 8% of the male population was killed during that war. That's the white population, and a much higher percentage of the Native American population. Philip himself was killed, and many of his followers were also killed or sold into slavery. So it was a very brutal, bloody conflict, and one that which some people have judged the Pilgrims and their descendants as not acquitting themselves with very much honor. But that's another deeper discussion that historians are still debating. It is important to understand how the colony expanded over time because it encompassed much more than the town of Plymouth. As more settlers arrived and became freeholders and received grants of land, it became necessary to create more towns. These included Duxbury, which was settled in 1627 and incorporated in 1637, and Scituate, settled in 1628, incorporated in 1636, and became a town of substantial size. All of Cape Cod, as we know now, the arm that sticks out into the Atlantic off of Massachusetts, was part of Plymouth Colony. And this map shows the other towns and their incorporation dates, including Sandwich, Barnstable, Yarmouth, Falmouth, Eastham, Rochester, Dartmouth, Freetown, Middleborough, Marshfield, Bridgewater, Taunton, Rehoboth, Little Compton, and Swansea. The latter three near the Rhode Island colony and the source of conflict that sparked the King Philip's War. We'll talk more about these towns in a moment, but you have to consider all of them when you think about the original Mayflower passengers and the possible places that their descendants moved as time progressed over the 17th century. They didn't all stay just in the town of Plymouth. I want to turn now to and look at some of the historical writing about Plymouth Colony in recent years. It is important to understand what historians are saying about the Pilgrims if we are to put their lives into historical context. In the 1800s, most books about Plymouth put the Pilgrims on pedestals. They were shown as great American heroes, the champions of self-government, to which we directly trace the aspirations of liberty during the Revolutionary War. The whole experiment in American democracy, they argued, can trace its origin to the Mayflower Compact. However, beginning in the 20th century, historians began to change what they thought about the Pilgrims and we continue to live in an era of historical revisionism. Um, the standard quote unquote new history of Plymouth appeared in 1945 by George Willison and was titled Saints and Strangers. It was written at the close of World War II, and he contrasted the so-called saints, the members of the Leiden congregation, with the strangers, the add-ons to the colony from England, whom he depicted as the saints' chief antagonists. His narrative is all about how the colony resolved conflicts and managed to create a thriving community, not unlike the modern American suburbia. He made a number of mistakes in the text that have been addressed by more recent writers, including the claim that Miles Standish never belonged to the Pilgrim Church, when in fact he stated that he may have had Catholic origins, but in fact Standish had moved away before the records of the Pilgrim Church began, and he had strong ties with the Leiden minister John Robinson, so he may have been a church member after all. Eugene Aubrey Stratton's book, Plymouth Colony, Its History and People, which was published in 1986, brings a genealogist's training to the study of the Pilgrims and includes a number of family details not previously addressed. Some critics have faulted it for breaking out biographies of individual Pilgrims and not giving enough attention to the overall chronology of the colony's history. He fails to give attention to some of the other towns in the colony, such as Scituate, which were important to the overall story of the colony. Much of the genealogical information is outdated by more recent discoveries about the Pilgrims themselves and their origins and their lives in Leiden. So again, these are dated books, but you'll find them on the shelf. Nathaniel Philbrick's book, Mayflower, published in 2006, is not really a history of Plymouth Colony, but it does set up a new thesis for the Pilgrims, framing their conflict not among saints against strangers, as Willison does, but instead a conflict between European-born settlers and Native Americans, which resulted in a new synthesis that turned the Indians into Americans. Rebecca Fraser's 2017 book, The Mayflower, The Families, the Voyage, and the Founding of America, gives special attention to Edward Winslow and his family's network of contacts. She illuminates the intertribal conflicts and rivalries that existed and provides a more complex picture of the colony than some other studies. She has been faulted, however, for using psychological speculation to explain some of her actions, or some of the actions of the Pilgrims. A couple more books. One is by Martin Whittock called Mayflower Lives, which was published in 2020, just last year. Takes a new approach to the colony by examining various lives in detail. It is not a cohesive chronological history of Plymouth Colony, and it is not in any sense a genealogical book, but his insights are helpful in putting various members of the Pilgrims into larger historical context, which is useful. John G. Turner's book, They Knew They Were Pilgrims, also published last year, incorporates elements shared by the other historians that Plymouth was a moribund backwater compared to Boston, that the conquering and enslaving of native peoples by Pilgrims is a source of mourning, not a source of giving thanks, and that the Pilgrims themselves should not be venerated. So it's a pretty hard book, takes a very hard view of the Pilgrims, maybe a harsher view than some other historians would. However, he does claim that the Plymouth colonists did establish, quote, a political framework with a significant degree of participation one that endured for nearly 70 years. However, their seizure of Indian land led directly to King Philip's War, which shattered both white and native communities across New England. So he is very critical of the Pilgrims because of that. He focuses on contested meanings of the term liberty as it played out in Plymouth Colony under many different nuances. So it's an interesting book. The books listed here are just a sampling of books that have been written in the last 40 years or so about Plymouth Colony. And they're all listed on your handout. I'm not going to go into all of them. Even if your interest is primarily genealogical and not historical, I think it's important for every Mayflower genealogist to have at least some appreciation for the historical background and the fact that there are various ways of interpreting the Pilgrims, studying them from different lenses. Even as genealogists, we should not sentimentalize them, but understand them with all their foibles and flaws. We can be justifiably proud that they managed to endure under extremely harsh conditions, but we should also be sensitive, I think, to the native peoples of New England and their sufferings that they endured at this time as well. So I want to turn now to the sources that you can use to research the passengers of Mayflower and their descendants. At the outset, you should know that the Pilgrims are among the best researched and best documented groups ever to settle in America. So much research has been done on them and their descendants through 5 generations that it is unlikely you will need to conduct original search on any of the early generations if you're trying to trace your own lineage back to the Mayflower. Most people attempting to do so get stuck at a much later period in the late 18th century or early 19th century in Western New England, in Maine, or New York, or New Jersey, or Pennsylvania, and not so much in Plymouth Colony itself. That said, there are a variety of original record sources for the colony that are available for researching the early settlers. These include, first and foremost, William Bradford's manuscript history of Plymouth Plantation, which we'll talk about in a moment, as well as a variety of other records. There are lists of freemen, especially people with citizenship status who were allotted land in the town. There are court records, there are town records, there are vital records, probate records, land records, church records, and finally journals and letters. And we will look at all of these that are available in published format. So, of Plymouth Plantation is one of the most remarkable historical manuscripts in American history and might be described as the earliest local history ever written in America. It was written by Governor William Bradford over a period of years between 1630 and 1652, and in it, he relates the history of the Pilgrims from about 1608 in Leiden through the 1620 voyage of the Mayflower to about 1647 in Plymouth Colony. He describes the original colonists in detail, including some background information, as well as their reactions to events that happened as the history of the colony unfolded. It has been called the preeminent literary work of 17th century America and the book that made the Pilgrims, quote, the spiritual ancestors of all America, unquote. The manuscript was lost from the time of the Revolutionary War when it was seized by an English and taken out of the Old South Meeting House in Boston and back to England. And it was rediscovered in the library of the Bishop of London in the 1850s. And after years of negotiations with various officials in England, the manuscript was finally returned, and it is now in the State Library of Massachusetts, where it has been since 1897. There are a number of published editions with various annotations. The most recent one to come out for the 400th anniversary is under the editorship of Kenneth Minkema, Francis Bremer, and Jeremy Bangs, and it reflects the latest level of scholarship. So this is the edition I would recommend that you use if you're planning to read it. It features 3 introductions, each by Minkema, Bremer, and Paula Peters, that place Bradford into the context as a historian and Plymouth Colony into a larger historical setting. Peters' essay is about the Patuxet and Wampanoag tribes, so it takes an Indian Native American perspective of the event. Bradford gives a lot of first-hand information about each of the passengers, and that information is one of the principal sources we have for both the Mayflower voyage and the early settlement of the colony. This edition contains the most up-to-date information about the people named in the text, which makes it the best version for genealogists to use. Next on the list of original sources are the freeman lists of the colony of Plymouth. These were recorded in court records and have been published in a multi-volume work called Records of the Colony of New Plymouth in New England, edited by Nathaniel B. Shirtleff and published in 1855. It's long out of copyright. It's viewable digitally online in many sources, including Internet Archive, so you can get to this from home on your computer. When one attained freeman status, one had the right to vote for colony officers. In some colonies, such as Massachusetts Bay, church membership was a prerequisite for obtaining freeman status, but that was not the case in Plymouth Colony. The lists include men who received freeman status at the time and others who were admitted later. Not everyone appearing as free later received this official status. The earliest lists date from 1633 to 1637. There are 4 later lists from 1639, 1658, 1670, and 1684. As people moved, the lists were updated. Other colony and court records are also part of the same set of books. They include transcripts of trials, court orders, jury lists, financial reports, accounting lists, civil vital records, and a great variety of other records that were recorded by the court. There is a set of later court records spanning from 1686 to 1859 for the county of Plymouth, and these may be helpful for identifying some descendants who remained in that area, but a lot of them left the area. Another original group of records are town meeting records. These were first published in 1889 in 3 volumes that begin with the year 1636. And only volume 1 covers the period that Plymouth was a colony. Town records contain different information from court records. They include information taken from town meetings. They also include a variety of other data, including livestock crop marks and other livestock information, appointments to town officers, the payment for wolf bounties, land grants, and other lists of landholders. One historian has commented that the colony officials tended to consolidate information from the town minute books and dispose of the original books. So remember that, consider the town minutes of other towns outside of Plymouth that were also part of Plymouth Colony, and they had separate town meeting books. The Situate records have recently been published, as have the records of Duxbury, Marshfield, Eastham, and Sandwich, all having their own town minutes with people living there. So that would be helpful if you think that your people moved out of the town of Plymouth itself. Vital records of the colony were kept originally by the town in a book called The Records of the Colony of New Plymouth, which we just addressed. There are alphabetical versions of vital records in print for all the towns of Plymouth Colony, but the better compilations are those that preserve the original order of the records rather than having them alphabetized. These are available for a number of towns, including Plymouth, Marshfield, Middleborough, Yarmouth, Swansea, and Falmouth. In this slide, the collection of Plymouth vital records is on the left as an example of a newer form of work where the records are in original order. The book on the right for Duxbury is an example of the older form of vital records where the records are in alphabetical order. Remember to look at all the vital records for all the towns in the colony. Another book worth mentioning is Plymouth Colony Marriages to 1650 by Robert S. Wakefield, published in 1977. All marriages in the colony at this time were civil marriages and did not take place in church. This book contains information about marriages that occurred and not necessarily official marriage records. For many couples, there is no official record, and one has to use other records to derive documentation of the event. Wakefield uses a variety of published sources, including genealogies, to compile his lists. Let's look at another original record source, which is probate records. These began to be kept in separate volumes in 1633. Many were first published in Shirtleff's volumes, Records of the Colony of New Plymouth, in 1855, but there is a newer version in 2 volumes by C.H. Simmons, titled Plymouth Colony Records, Wills and Inventories, 1633 to 1669, which was published by Picton Press in 1996. Again, these are both on your handout. These are probably the best versions to use for this early period. Earlier versions of these records were compiled by George Bowman and included in the Mayflower Descendant Journal, which is a major journal for studying the Pilgrims. The first counties in Plymouth Colony were not created until 1685, and they included Barnstable, Bristol, and Plymouth. Each of these began keeping probate records in their own separate courts when the counties were created. I also recommend the book Plymouth Colony Probate Guide by Ruth Wilder Sherman and Robert S. Wakefield. This work contains abstracts of every probate record from the colony known from 1633 to 1691, when the colony was absorbed into Massachusetts Bay. It includes records from about 725 men and 75 women, and there is a bibliography in the back to published records from specific counties. I should also mention Susan Roser's book, Mayflower Deeds and Probates, which contains an abstract of the files of George Ernest Bowman, 1860 to 1941, who is considered the father of modern Mayflower genealogy. He was the founding editor of the Mayflower Descendant journal, and he did copious research in the early records of Plymouth Colony. Attempting to research all of the descendants of the Mayflower passengers to his own time, he took notes and accumulated over 20,000 pages of research using probate, court, church, cemetery, and Bible records, which he placed with the General Society of Mayflower Descendants. Roser abstracted all the deed and probate records in Bowman's notes. It is a massive work, but it is not derived from the original records. It is derived from Bowman's records. The earliest deeds from the colony were recorded in the court records, which are part of that shirt-left book, Records of the Colony of Early New Plymouth, Volume 12. Additional land grants can be found in passing through the first 6 volumes of the set. The next 2 deed volumes, spanning from 1651 to 63 and 1664 to 1671, are compiled by Jeremy Bangs and are published relatively recently on Lulu. We have them here in our collection. The database for volume 3, part 2 of this series, which covers from 1671 to 1673, was not published in book form, but is available online through the American Ancestors website. It's not available in book form, so you have to look at it there. You have to either be a subscriber to it or access the American Ancestors database from a library like us. Bangs has also compiled a book called Indian Deeds, Land Transactions in Plymouth Colony 1620 to 1691. This book looks exclusively at deed transactions between colonists and Native Americans belonging to several tribes, including the Quechahasset, the Sepit, the Webocoet, the Mataquason, and many other tribes indigenous to Cape Cod and the region that made up Plymouth. A lengthy introduction sets the deeds into historical context, showing the deeds to be a form of dispossession and theft, especially after reservations guaranteed to the various tribes were routinely ignored. While it doesn't have a lot of genealogical information in it regarding the colonists, there are a number of Indian names especially mentioned, which makes it a valuable resource for tracing Native Americans if you do descend from a Native American in New England. Each town established in Plymouth Colony had a church. Historian Robert Charles Anderson notes that religious records are one of the most important sources for identifying colonists, but he says that the churches in this colony had more difficulty attracting ministers to their pulpits than did Massachusetts Bay to the north. Accordingly, the church records were not maintained as completely or as regularly as they were in Massachusetts. For the town of Plymouth, there are 2 volumes of church records compiled under the auspices of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts in 1920 and reprinted in 1975. And again, these are on your handout. These include a church history written by Governor Bradford and Nathaniel Morton, as well as later histories by various ministers through 1859. There are some baptismal and burial records, but not until the 18th century. Recall that the early Plymouth colonists did not believe in either church marriages or church burials. Sometimes you will find a death record as an obituary in the minutes, such as when John Howland died in 1673 at the age of 80, and he was described as a, quote, good old disciple and had been a magistrate here, a plain-hearted Christian, end quote. Many of the records might best be described as minutes or governing documents that lay out the covenant by which the church was governed. So they had a set of principles by which they governed themselves. Situate's church records were kept by the Reverend John Lothrop, who later moved with his congregation to Barnstable, and these records were recorded in the New England Historic Genealogical Register, volumes 9 and 10. But also remember to look for church records of other towns in the colony. Finally, there are a variety of private manuscripts and diaries that provide information about the colony and its inhabitants, in addition to Bradford's history. Bradford kept a letter book between 1624 and 1630, the only one that survives, and these were transcribed in the Mayflower Descendant Journal over a series of articles in volumes between 5 and 7. Edward Winslow wrote a book called Good News from New England in 1624, and contributed to another book titled Mort's Relation. Both offer firsthand descriptions of the colony. Finally, Governor John Winthrop in Massachusetts Bay wrote letters and kept a diary, both of which contain information about Plymouth Colony, including his views on a variety of matters that are not part of Plymouth's official court records. So again, another perspective of a person living outside the colony, but who was writing back and forth to people in the colony. So we have surveyed the original records of the Plymouth Colony in the town of Plymouth, which are available in published form and include even digitized. I want to turn to some work of some of the other researchers that are out there. And there are a number of great genealogical works. As the most studied group by far in American history, there's a lot of genealogical information about the Pilgrims. A rule of thumb to use when evaluating these works is that the more recent ones are generally better because they contain the most up-to-date information. A lot of ongoing research is happening in English records right now in an effort to find new clues about the origins of the passengers. For some, like the famed John Alden, his exact birthplace still remains unknown. No birth record for him has been located, and there is no definitive proof of his parentage. Similarly, there are several women on the Mayflower whose maiden names remain unknown, including that of Mary, wife of William Brewster. Edward Fuller's wife is unknown altogether. For others, there are exciting new discoveries. Isaac Allerton's birthplace has been discovered recently in East Bergholt, Suffolk. The best, most up-to-date book on Mayflower genealogy right now is Robert Charles Anderson's Mayflower Migration, Immigrants to Plymouth 1620, which was published in 2020 for the 400th anniversary. Anderson examines every passenger on the ship, presents what facts can be known from the historical record, and summarizes all of the pertinent genealogical literature. Anderson is really the foremost genealogical scholar on the whole Puritan migration to New England, and he has headed what was called the Great Migration Project for the New England Historic Genealogical Society in Boston. Anderson's Great Migration books all follow the similar format. They include the name, the origin, in this case, the last known residence for the man in this volume is Leiden, previous residences, which includes the birthplace if known, migration date, first residence, removes, occupation, church membership, freeman status, education, offices held, civil offices, birth, death, marriage, children, associations, pre-emigration biography, which is a new category for this book, comments, and bibliographic notes. For this particular volume, each Mayflower passenger is introduced by remarks made by William Bradford in his Plymouth Plantation history about that person. So in this one, we see Isaac Allerton, and we see in italics at the top what William Bradford wrote about Allerton. And then you see the information about him, where he lived, his origin before coming to America, which is Leiden, that he'd been from East Bergholt in Suffolk. His first residence was in Plymouth, then he moved to Marblehead, then New Amsterdam, then New Haven, return trips, and just all kinds of great information about him as you go through the list. And again, this is the most up-to-date, most correct information you're going to find in print. Anderson's earlier book is titled The Pilgrim Migration, Immigrants to Plymouth Colony, 1620 to 1633, published in 2004. This work not only includes all the Mayflower passengers, but also many more early colonists to the colony before the big immigration to Massachusetts Bay began in 1635. So this will include people who came on the later ships like the Fortune and the Anne and the Little James and so forth that came into the colony in the later part of the 1620s. Sketches in the previous book, Mayflower Migration, are longer and more up to date than in this one, but still it's probably the best book for those in print, best book in print for those that came to Plymouth on a later ship. The bibliographic notes are really helpful and will lead you to articles written about those passengers in which further information about the family may be found. And you really have to look into the journals. We'll talk more about that in a minute, because a lot of new research is being done and published in journals rather than in books. Okay, the most important source for tracing the descendants of the Mayflower passengers is called the Silver Books. These are the descendants through 5 generations produced by the Society of Mayflower Descendants. These are highly documented works and are all encompassing, identifying every line down, usually into the 1700s. Some passengers, the lines are traced even further into the 6th, 7th, and 8th generations in all lines. However, not all of them go down this far. The books are compiled by different authors who are experts on those lines. There are 25 volumes in all, and many volumes have multiple parts. So like in this picture, you see volume 18 has parts 1, 2, and 3. So that's all considered part of 18, even though they're 3 separate volumes. The set was first begun in 1975, and they're still coming out. Some of the earlier volumes have been revised in new editions with corrected or supplement information. So always look for the newest edition of these, not at the original edition, because they've gone out of date. So here's a sample page from the Brewster volume, which is volume 24, part 1 of the set, which covers my ancestors. I just wanted to show it. The information appears in very standard New England Register format, and everything is meticulously documented. All the volumes follow high documentation standards, but because these books were prepared by different authors, they may appear slightly different from one family to another. If you are working to prove a line to the Mayflower Society, you will still have to provide citations to original records in your application, but the notations in the Silver Book for that particular line will help you with that process, even though you can't cite these books directly in your application. Use these books for identifying lines and use the documentation to pursue the original records that back it up. You can be confident that if a line is included, it is considered proved, even though you will need to provide the proofs in your application. Going beyond the Silver Books and finding your own line to a Mayflower passenger will lead you to elsewhere for later records of proof. And as I said, most people who are stuck in their research are hampered not by the first 6 generations down from the passenger. They're stuck later at a time in upstate New York or in Vermont or Maine or Western Massachusetts, where the vital records can sometimes be scarce, especially after the Revolutionary War. It will help to consider sources of migrations out of Plymouth and where the descendants headed when they moved west. Obviously, since we are tracing the descendants of 24 people, by 1700s, there are thousands of people who are their descendants, and they moved around quite widely. Still, it is much less likely you will find them in the South than you will find them in Western New England or in the Midwestern states, such as Michigan, Ohio, and elsewhere, which had large numbers of New England settlers. A researcher named Susan Roser, we've talked about her already, has worked extensively on books about Mayflower descendants and has published a number of books. One is called Mayflower Increasings, published in its 2nd edition. I'm going to go back here, this one here. And this book is a book of gathered genealogies on Mayflower passengers. Most of it's likely superseded by the Silver Books, but it bears checking for a particular line. Another of her books, published in 2011, is called The Mayflower Passenger References from Contemporary Records and Scholarly Journals. This book, she gathers references about each of the passengers from original sources, including the Leiden archives and various colony sources, about each Mayflower passenger. And she uses such journals as the Mayflower Descendant, the American Genealogist, and the New England Register. It is now out of date, but it's still a helpful book. While I wouldn't use this work as a substitute for doing research directly in the original sources, there may be references in here that you may not have seen and is worth checking. She has done a 3rd book, not pictured here, called Mayflower Deeds and Probates, which is arranged alphabetically by passenger's name and includes various references to will and deed records for those passengers. And this is one called Mayflower Source Records, which was published from articles that appeared in the New England Historic and Genealogical Register, which has been published since the 1840s and contains a significant amount of material on people in New England, all over New England. In 1986, this book was compiled. It's taken from articles that appeared in there about southeastern Massachusetts, Cape Cod, Nantucket, and Martha's Vineyard. They consist mostly of church registers and a few probate records, together with a selected number of cemetery records. The American Ancestors website is a great website for doing research. We subscribe to it here at the Allen County Public Library, but many other libraries get it as well, and you can subscribe to it as an individual too. You go online and you can, as you get into their website, you can get subscription information from the New England Society in Boston, which publishes it. All the back issues of the New England Register are on here, and they're fully name indexed. So this is a great way of finding and doing research in those journals. This website also has a variety of other record sources for New England, including some unique content not found anywhere else online. So you can click at the search box at the top left where that green arrow is, and you can get to a box where you have a search screen where you can put in the name for the person you're looking for. You can limit it to various types of records, such as military records or journals or periodicals, vital records, the Great Migration Project, published genealogies, court, land, and probate records, and so on. So it's a great tool for using New England research, and I always recommend people who come to our library who are doing New England work to use American Ancestors. The Mayflower Descendant is another scholarly journal besides the Register, which has been published by the by the Massachusetts Society of Mayflower Descendants since 1899. There was a gap in its publication between 1938 and 1984, but it was resumed in 1985, and it is still being published today. It's considered one of the top-notch journals on Mayflower research. And when new discoveries are made in English records, often you will find the article in here because this is the sort of the preferred place to publish it. Its content is not always on American Ancestors, though. Sometimes you'll find even Dutch records in here. The journal has published a lot of value of material of high quality. In 2019, it published an article about the Y-DNA evidence of a man named John Sprague, whose birth father was likely Samuel Fuller Jr., based on his Y-DNA, and who was the grandson of Samuel Fuller Sr., who came on the Mayflower. So his descendants of the name Sprague were unaware of this relationship, but DNA paved the way to making the connection. So this will be the type of articles you're going to find in here, some really good cutting edge research that use DNA and so forth. And by the way, they've developed and studied the DNA of many of the Mayflower passengers through the male line descendants. They know what the Y-DNA looks like of most of the male line passengers that have descendants. So to get the back issues of these, you have to go online. You have to subscribe to the Massachusetts chapter of Mayflower Descendants and go on their website. We have a complete set of their journals here in our library, and it is widely available in other libraries too. Another website is by a man named Caleb Johnson, who has done mayflowerhistory.com. This is a great research website. It's devoted specifically to the Mayflower. And Johnson himself is one of the foremost Mayflower researchers today. He's done a number of articles on the English origins of various passengers that have appeared in various journals. His major discovery published in 2019 was the discovery of the ancestral town of Isaac Allerton. The website does not include a lot of scholarship, but it does have a lot of useful links. There are links to passenger lists of the early ships to the colony, links to the Leiden archives, links to the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, and there are links to a number of digitized versions of books, as well as books that are for sale. A new tool for researching Mayflower Descendants is the Mayflower Descendants Search Portal, which was launched last year on Family Search. This database, which was just getting started, will index and reference names taken from applications to the Mayflower Society, which could become a great tool for finding descendants going beyond the silver books. The collection is still in its infancy and not many names are available yet. It is not completely clear from which chapters and which applications will be drawn or scanned. Most states have their own chapters of Mayflower Descendants, but all have to be approved by the General Secretary of the organization. Look for the database to grow over time as more records are digitized and indexed. Remember that in the early days of the descendant organization, people could join the Mayflower Society without the same standards of proof that exists today. So I wouldn't necessarily take for granted anybody that you see listed in a Mayflower Society as being necessarily right, but it is a good clue to use if you're doing research on your own line. For the time we have left, I want to talk a little bit about the finding of potential Mayflower descendants and connecting them to a known line back to one of the passengers. It is a bit difficult to give advice on doing this kind of research. There's so many different lines of descent and so many different variables at play here. It helps to visualize the early American colonies and get a sense of where the descendants went. The original grant to Plymouth Council had been for a huge amount of territory from Canada to the lower boundary of Pennsylvania, but that claim was never enforced and overlapped with the claims of Massachusetts Bay. Various waves of Puritans entered New England through the so-called Great Migration, which lasted from 1620 to about 1638. You can see Plymouth Colony in the southern part of Massachusetts. The colony butted up against Rhode Island. Many descendants stayed put in Massachusetts while others moved into other parts of New England over time. Some continued westward into Rhode Island and Connecticut, and there went into New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. Others went into western Massachusetts, then followed the Connecticut River northward up into New Hampshire and Vermont. Other lines, including mine, went from Cape Cod area and then went up into Maine near Portland area, and then from there went further west. Mine came directly to Fort Wayne from Maine. So that's just one of the different migration patterns you'll see. After the Revolutionary War, there was a lot of migration. We had a new country, and there was a lot of new land opening up in the West, although we were still fighting the Indians and the English in Indiana and Ohio and parts of that area. There was a lot of movement into New York and into Ohio and Ohio's Western Reserve and further inland. So it was a very mobile time, a time when people were uprooting themselves and reinventing themselves in other places. And this is the time period that it's very difficult for Mayflower people to make their connections because of all this movement, because record keeping wasn't as good after the Revolutionary War for a lot of the New England towns. And of course, New York didn't keep file records at all. They kept church records. So it gets very tough then to trace people and make the connections back when you're in this period between 1780 and say 1810, which is a very difficult period to research. Here's a couple of maps to show you about sort of the migration patterns. The one on the right shows the settled areas of America in 1800, which is really quite small considering how much land there was. So the people were moving inward. They were settling in New York and Pennsylvania and down into the southern states, and then some into Kentucky, northern part of Kentucky and southern part of Ohio around 1800. These were people who were mostly 7th and 8th generation descendants of the Pilgrims. Very few of them went into the South. The movement was mostly to the north and to the west. As the old Northwest Territory opened up, which was now Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, many New Englanders settled in these areas. So you have a lot of New England roots in the old upper Northwest territories. We are in a very difficult era in the post-Revolutionary War period because of record keeping, and a lot of clerks just didn't keep record keeping, and people used to bring in their family Bibles and record their children's births in the records before the Revolutionary War, but after that, they stopped doing that in large numbers, so it's much more difficult to get complete vital record information than there was before the war. Many were leaving the old churches, the old Congregationalist churches, and taking up a new denominations. There were Methodists and Baptists and other evangelical churches that were springing up. Eventually the Mormon church would spring up. And so you had people leaving these old churches and going into new ones and not necessarily having the same records that they had in the earlier days. So the challenge becomes in finding every record, every probate record, every land record, every court record, every religious record, cemetery records. Try to get yourself back into early New England from this later period of time. The 400th anniversary and its aftermath spawned a lot of research. There were lots of organizations that collected information from people about their Mayflower lines. Look for the silver books to continue, although most of them now have a book about them. The one exception is Moses Fletcher, who was the man that came over as a blacksmith, as an old man. His children stayed behind in Holland, and they married Dutch people, and they stayed in the Netherlands. So they have descendants. He has descendants, but they're Dutch. They're not in America. And so that silver book has not yet been done. I expect that one will be done in the future. They're trying to work through the Dutch records, trying to find his descendants. But there are a lot of people in the Netherlands today that descend from him that qualify as Mayflower descendants. So this is that was going on last year during the 400th anniversary. Finally, there's a useful book, fun book by Gary Boyd Roberts that came out called the Mayflower 500, which traces the descents of a variety of famous people from different fields back to a Mayflower passenger. This book does not contain a lot of supporting documentation. You certainly can't use it for proof getting into a Mayflower society, but it may be helpful and kind of fun to find out if you're related to a particular actor or scientist or president or someone who was a well-known figure who extends back to the Mayflower. So I guess I want to conclude by saying Happy Thanksgiving. This is the 400th anniversary of that Thanksgiving meal. I hope you will take this time to hammer away at your own possible Mayflower connection. It can be a fun experience. It's a way to connect you in a very personal way to American history. It's a great way to teach our younger generations about their past. So if you want dinner table conversation and you are a Mayflower descendant, by all means, talk about the Pilgrims. And even if you're not, it's a great time to talk about stories about family and to share the stories of your family history with other generations. So use Thanksgiving as a time to reconnect and to tell stories.